Hi, my name is Rick Langer, and I'm your host for iFlips, Internet Faith Learning Integration Presentations. And this iFlip will think just a little bit about the integration of faith and learning in what's sometimes called the STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Obviously, the integration of faith and learning can be a challenge in these disciplines, and this iFlip will just take a look at a few general principles that may help build some integrative bridges. And in fact, using that metaphor, one of the things you do when you build a bridge is find the narrowest places to build the bridge across, so the span of the bridge doesn't have to be any greater than is absolutely necessary. The other thing that you do is tend to build a bridge from both directions. And so part of what I'm going to do here is to try and identify some places where the land is narrowest between biblical and theological concerns and scientific concerns as represented in the STEM disciplines. And then I'll also try and make a few suggestions for how those might kind of reach out to one another, that you might build the bridge a little bit from both sides. The first narrow point that we might identify is the tendency of science to just investigate and attempt to understand the world, the inclination to discover, to solve problems and puzzles that one encounters. These are things that are very deeply embedded in natural sciences, but they reflect, I would argue, part of the image of God and man, our ability not only to know and understand it all, but to be self-reflectively aware of that process. The power of naming that is shown in Genesis chapter 1 is also a thing that science does a lot of, simply in creating taxonomies, descriptive analyses of the things that occur in nature. In many ways, a huge amount of zoology and biology is simply a continuing process of the naming of the animals that Adam begins in the original creation narrative. It also seems that the investigation of the natural world is a thing that's not only permitted in Scripture, but actually encouraged. As Psalm 25:2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search things out." Solomon is praised for his knowledge of the natural world, and people come to marvel at the things that he's discovered. So these activities seem to be things that are endorsed as part of the sorts of things God would have people do. And so I think science is doing something that has good permissions for it, so to speak, scripturally. A second narrow point between science and theology is the very, very deep tendency of science to be drawn towards notions of simplicity, elegance, and beauty. An awful lot of scientific work is not simply the collection of facts, which we just described, and it isn't simply putting things into a taxonomy or a list of things that we have discovered, but it often involves theory building, giving explanatory accounts of how things came to be the way they are. Why is the taxonomy looking the way it is? And when you do that, you discover one of the key things scientists use are notions of beauty or elegance or simplicity as a justifying account for why a particular story, a particular narration, a particular theory might be true. For example, we don't simply observe chemical behavior of a particular atom or molecule. We place that atom into a periodic table. Then we theorize about periods, or map periods onto atomic structure and electron orbitals, classify and observe reactions and predict possible reactions based upon the location within a periodic table. Science is about theory, not just observation, in the same way that history is about story, not just about historical facts. Theory building and storytelling are all about identifying design and order. It's helping us discover how things fit together. And particularly as a Christian, this can and should include our attaching theories and observations back to the knowledge and worship of God. Building theories is also in some ways how we imitate God. You think of God as a God who called order out of chaos, and we do the same thing often with the observations that come into our sense perception. They come to us from all kinds of places and times, and one of the key things we do as scientists is organize, structure, and take the raw material of sense perception and create out of it a well-formed cosmos, so to speak, in this case an intellectual or mental framework that gives a good and structured and ordered account of the world in which we live. It's also interesting to think why it even is that we count things like simplicity and elegance and beauty as somehow a marker that we've really found reality. And I would argue that shows lying underneath our perceptions of reality is an expectation of order, that we believe somehow that ultimate reality is something that is elegant. And when it seems chaotic, disordered, or complex, we often just feel like we haven't gotten to the bottom of things yet. And I think this probably reflects the fact that we are formed in an image of a God of peace and harmony, and a God who created the world in a systematic and peaceful sort of fashion. Another narrow bridge between science and theology is the whole area of wonder and awe. It is very common in the Psalms to see the psalmist looking at different aspects of creation, be it looking up at the starry skies or marveling at the fact that every animal seemed to have its proper place, be it the eagle up in his nest or the badger hiding among the rocks. The keen ability to observe nature and to reflect upon it and to see in it things that are marvelous or wonderful or beautiful. These are things that are very, very common in Scripture, but they're also part of science, that we look at things that might seem ordinary to another person, but say, wait a minute, something amazing and marvelous is going on in there. And as we investigate more deeply, we often find things being ever increasingly complex. Charles Darwin thought that if he had a big enough microscope, he would look down at the smallest cell and find some kind of indifferentiated form of protoplasm there. The reality now is that we look down and we find, instead of that inside of cell, we find complexity that would remind us of a modern urban city where you have, in effect, roads going this way and that are well ordered with traffic going one way on one side and one way on the other, all as part of the organelles and structures within the context of a living cell. So everywhere we go, there's another place where we find marvel, where we find wonder, and where we find awe. And in that sense, I think science should be evoking in us a very natural sense of praise and worship of God. A fourth narrow point between science and theology is the area of technology. Technology takes the finding of science and makes use of it. And in effect, what it's doing is it's helping human beings to live and flourish and thrive in the world in which we've been placed. And I would argue that this is actually part of God's mandate for human beings, that we go out into the world and not only multiply and fill in the sense of reproducing, but that we also work on the world, so to speak. We don't just multiply and fill, but we also rule and subdue. We take the raw material of the created order, the starting point we find within it, and make it a habitable home. This is a thing that God has called us to do. It is part of the human vocation. And part of how we do that is through technological means. We find out something about the earth, the way it works, and then we make things that allow not only us to flourish, but ideally the rest of the created order as well. That we are in effect tenders of a garden that we're trying to make flourish, we're trying to make beautiful, and our abilities in the sciences help translate into tangible actions in fulfilling our call to stewardship. And a final connection between the natural sciences and theology is an apologetic one. I think this has been a thing that has been identified in many times. Sometimes these are arguments related to cosmogenesis and where did the entire cosmos come from. We find descriptions from physicists about the delicate balancing of the different forces, the nuclear force, strong and weak nuclear forces, and gravitational forces and electromagnetic forces. And these sorts of things that are so delicately balanced that lead one to wonder how could this be are often formed into, if not arguments or proofs for the existence of God, at the very least evidences or corroborations of the reasonableness of the belief in God. These things, even if they do not count as a proof for the existence of God, are often things that may be good corroborative reasons for belief in God. And I think that's a very worthwhile apologetic aspect that is often found in the natural sciences. So these are some of the ways in which you might narrow the gap between natural science and theology, and hopefully begin a process of sort of integrative bridge building to make connection between the disciplines. Thanks for joining us for this iFlip.